My husband signed the divorce papers like he was autographing his own victory, the kind of smooth, arrogant flourish that says, "I am done pretending you matter." He did it in open court in front of a judge who had seen 1,000 broken marriages, and he still found a way to make it a performance. He leaned back in his chair afterward, rolled the pen between his fingers, and looked at me with that thin smile that carried 3 years of contempt. Then he chuckled under his breath, loud enough for me to hear, but soft enough that the judge could pretend she did not. "Useless," he said, tasting the word like dessert. "My name is Jessica Williams. I am 28 years old, and that word had been living in my house like a second tenant. Useless, invisible, background. It followed me from our third-floor walk-up apartment in South Baltimore to the fluorescent hallway outside Courtroom 4B of Harbor County Family Court, where the air smelled like floor wax burnt coffee and the quiet panic of people trying not to fall apart in public. The radiator at home clanked and hissed like an angry animal, but in that courthouse, everything was too clean, too bright, too controlled, like the building itself had no patience for human mess. Caleb Williams sat beside his attorney, smug as a man with no children, no mortgage, and no real consequences. He was 34, handsome, in that polished, predictable way with a jawline that made strangers assume he was trustworthy. His suit was new. Deep navy tailored closed the fabric catching the courtroom light when he shifted. He had bought it with money he told me we did not have. He had told me we needed to tighten our budget, that my grocery receipts were undisciplined, that buying fresh fruit was a luxury, that my new shoes could wait. But he always had money for what made him look like the hero in his own story. Behind him in the gallery sat Madison Price, 24, paralegal at his firm, blonde hair, blown smooth lips, glossy legs crossed like she owned the place. She was not supposed to be there. People usually hide their affair until the ink dries. But Caleb was so drunk on his own narrative that he brought her to watch the ending. She leaned forward close enough that her perfume drifted over him in little sweet waves, and she smiled at me without warmth, the way you smile at a woman you have already replaced. I sat alone at the other table, hands folded in my lap, wearing a charcoal gray dress I had owned for 5 years. It was modest, a little faded at the seams, the kind of clothing that makes you disappear. That was the point. Caleb wanted me to look small. He wanted the room to believe his narrative before anyone asked questions. He wanted the judge to see him as a hard-working attorney cutting loose dead weight. He wanted Madison to see him as a king, and he wanted me to either break down or explode so he could point and say, "See, this is why I had to leave." Judge Marlo Carter sat high on the bench, late 60s hair pulled back, glasses sharp as her tone. She moved through the case file quickly, tired but attentive, like a woman who did not have time for theatrics. The clerk typed. The bailiff stood with his hands clasped in front of him. Paperwork rustled. A couple in the front row whispered. Somewhere down the hall, someone was crying in a low, exhausted way. "Case number 492, the bailiff announced. Williams versus Williams. Petition for dissolution of marriage." Judge Carter glanced at our file, then looked at Caleb. "No minor children. No jointly held real estate. Minimal joint assets. Petitioner waives spousal support." Caleb's attorney stood confident. "That is correct, Your Honor. We are requesting a clean decree today." "Mrs. Williams," the judge said, turning to me, "do you agree to these terms?" I stood slowly. I kept my face neutral. "Yes, Your Honor." Caleb smiled like he could already taste the freedom. He tapped his pen against the table. He glanced at Madison like they were about to go celebrate. Then he looked at me and leaned in just enough for the insult to land with precision. "Make it quick," he murmured. "I have real work to do. You can go back to whatever it is you do all day." The judge began to speak again, ready to finalize it. "Very well. If there are no other motions, I will sign the decree and—" The courtroom doors opened, not the soft swing of someone slipping in late. A hard, deliberate opening that made every head turn. A clerk stepped inside, carrying a sealed black envelope thick and heavy, the kind of delivery that does not belong in a room full of cheap manila folders. There was red wax pressed into an insignia on the flap. A bright label sat on the front, stamped urgent, and the clerk held it like it mattered more than any of us. He walked straight up the center aisle, bypassing the bailiff, bypassing the polite rules of this little room, and went directly to the bench. "Your Honor," the clerk said, breathless. "This just arrived by courier. It is marked for immediate inclusion in this case file." Caleb frowned. His attorney stiffened. Madison sat up straighter. The judge took the envelope and examined the seal. The boredom drained from her face. Something sharpened in her eyes like a blade pulled from a sheath. "What court?" she asked. "Delaware Chancery, Your Honor," the clerk replied. Caleb let out a short laugh that sounded like disbelief and arrogance welded together. "This is ridiculous," he whispered to his attorney. "She is trying to pull a stunt." I did not move. I did not speak. I watched the judge slide a letter opener under the wax and slice it cleanly. The sound of tearing paper echoed in the silence like a warning shot. She pulled out documents printed on thick bond paper. She read the first page. Her eyebrows drew together. She blinked and read it again. Then she looked up and stared at me, not with sympathy, not with judgment, but with surprise that felt almost physical. Caleb's smile faltered. Madison's perfume suddenly felt too sweet, too loud, like someone had spilled it in the room. Caleb leaned forward. "What is that?" he demanded, and his voice cracked on the last word. The judge did not answer him right away. She turned another page. Her hands, steady for everything else, paused for the smallest second. Then she lifted her gaze to Caleb, and the look on her face changed from surprise to something colder, not anger, not emotion. Assessment. The look you give a man when you realize he has been reckless and you are about to teach him what consequences feel like. "Counsel," she said, voice lower. "Mr. Harlan, are you aware of this filing?" Caleb's attorney swallowed. "No, Your Honor. We have not been served with any additional discovery." "This is not discovery," Judge Carter said. "This is a certified probate execution and valuation summary from the estate of Elias H. Halstead." Caleb snorted. "Halstead? Who is that?" "Her grandfather leaving her a box of knitting needles." The judge snapped her eyes to him. "Mr. Williams, you will be quiet." Madison went still. Her smile drained away, replaced by a tight, calculating stare. Caleb's confidence wavered, but he tried to cover it by leaning back like he was still in control. Judge Carter read again slower this time, as if the numbers refused to behave like normal numbers. "These assets are confirmed as separate property under the prenuptial agreement submitted to this court. Controlling interest in Halstead Maritime Risk, mineral rights portfolios, logistics infrastructure holdings, blind trust valuations." Caleb's attorney cleared his throat, scrambling. "Your Honor, with respect, this seems highly irregular. The respondent is an administrative assistant. There are no assets in this marriage." The judge lifted her head. "Then you should have asked better questions," she said, and her voice cut through the room like ice. She looked down at the paper again. "The estimated valuation listed here exceeds $1.2 trillion. The word trillion did not land like a number. It landed like a natural disaster. The courtroom went silent so fast it felt like someone had pulled the oxygen out. The clerk stopped typing. The bailiff shifted his stance. A woman in the gallery gasped a small, involuntary sound. Caleb did not blink. He stared at the judge like his brain had lost its place. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His skin went pale, then blotchy, then pale again, like his body could not decide whether to panic or collapse. Madison's hand, which had been resting near his shoulder, pulled back like she had touched a hot stove. For 3 years, Caleb had treated me like furniture. He had mocked my quiet job, my thrift, the way I kept our home running when he was chasing his title. He had told his mother I was low value. He had let his family call me a burden at Thanksgiving, laughing when his brother asked if I was going to trap Caleb with a baby to secure child support. He had used the word useless like it was a joke they all shared. And now a judge was reading a number that made those insults look like a child scribbling lies on a napkin. The judge flipped to another document. "There is also an addendum to the prenuptial agreement," she said, and her eyes narrowed. "Notarized on the date of marriage. Clause 4, Section B. It states that should either party contest the validity of separate property, that party is liable for 100% of the opposing party's legal fees and punitive damages." Caleb jerked in his chair like the words physically hit him. "No," he said hoarse. "We signed a standard prenuptial agreement. That is not in there." "It is in there," the judge replied, and she tapped the page with her finger. Your signature is next to the notary seal. Caveat subscriptor. Let the signer beware. Caleb's eyes snapped to me. For the first time in our marriage, he truly looked at me. Not past me, not through me, at me, like he was searching my face for the small, scared woman he believed he had married. Like he was waiting for me to giggle and admit it was a prank. Like he was begging reality to be negotiable. I held his gaze with the calm I had practiced for years. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not speak. I simply let him see what he had refused to see, that my silence was never weakness. It was decision. Because before I ever walked into that courthouse, I had already said goodbye to Jessica, the wife, the helper, the woman who apologized for taking up space. And in my bag, beneath a plain folder of bank statements, was a black notebook with a spine worn soft from use. Not a diary. A dossier. Dates. Receipts. Transfers. Messages. Every ethical shortcut. Every lie. Every time he moved money through a shell company and tried to hang the debt on my name. I had let him believe I was nothing long enough to let him show exactly who he was when he thought no one important was watching. Caleb had wanted a quick divorce. He wanted to erase me. Instead, he had just signed the first page of his own downfall, right in front of a judge, right in front of his mistress, right in front of the world he was desperate to impress. And the worst part for him was not the money he would never touch. It was the realization settling into his bones, slow and sickening, that he had spent 3 years looking down on the only person in the room who could ruin him without raising her voice. After the judge called a recess and the room dissolved into frantic whispers and stiff smiles that could not hide the panic underneath, I gathered my bag and walked out of courtroom 4B alone, the same way I had walked into it, because spectacle was never my role, and it still was not. The hallway felt longer than before, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were impatient with everyone in it, and I moved through clusters of people who suddenly looked at me differently. Like gravity had shifted without warning, and they were afraid of standing too close. I did not look back at Caleb. I did not look at Madison. I did not look at his attorney scrambling to whisper into a phone. I stepped outside the courthouse into the cold Baltimore air and let the doors close behind me, sealing in the chaos I had no intention of managing. The sky was a flat, exhausted gray, the kind that pressed down on your shoulders, and rain misted the pavement just enough to darken the concrete. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and started the walk back to my apartment because I had learned long ago that grounding yourself in routine is the fastest way to keep your hands from shaking when something monumental cracks open beneath your feet. My apartment was 6 blocks away, a 3rd-floor walk-up over a closed nail salon and a struggling tax office, and every stair creaked in a familiar pattern that felt steadier than anything else in my life that morning. Inside, the air was cool and stale, carrying the faint metallic smell of the radiator and the lemon cleaner I used sparingly because it lasted longer that way. The furniture was mismatched and worn, nothing that would photograph well or impress guests, which was precisely why Caleb had always hated it. He said it made him feel small, like he was living in a place that did not reflect his potential. To me, it felt quiet and contained a place where nothing demanded I perform. I set my bag down by the door, kicked off my flats, and stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock, waiting for the adrenaline to drain enough that my thoughts could line up properly. This was the space where I had learned to make myself invisible on purpose. Not because I was ashamed, but because invisibility is a kind of armor when you are surrounded by people who mistake volume for strength. The couch sagged in the middle where I sat every evening with a library book and a cup of tea, my shoes tucked neatly underneath so they would not clutter the room. The kitchen was barely large enough to turn around in, but everything had a place. The chipped white mug by the sink, the jar of rice on the counter, the envelope taped to the refrigerator with my monthly budget written in careful, even handwriting. Caleb used to mock that list, calling it obsessive, asking why I tracked every dollar like we were one emergency away from disaster. What he never understood was that I tracked it because I wanted to know exactly how much silence cost. The less I spent, the quieter I could live. The quieter I lived, the less attention I drew. And the less attention I drew, the more people showed me who they really were. I had been working as an administrative assistant at a small logistics firm since I was 21, answering phones, scheduling meetings, filing reports that no one read unless something went wrong. It was the kind of job people dismiss without thinking the kind that disappears into the background of other people's success. Caleb loved to describe it as a placeholder, something I would eventually grow out of once I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. He never asked if I already knew. He never asked why I stayed. He assumed it was because I could not do better. That assumption made him comfortable. It made his family comfortable, too. Karen, my mother-in-law, used to tilt her head and ask if I was still at that little office like it was a phase I had stubbornly refused to outgrow. Luke would laugh and ask if I had learned how to use Excel, yet then turn to Caleb and say he could not imagine settling for so little. They said these things at dinner at holidays in my own living room, confident that I would either laugh along or retreat into myself. I did neither. I listened. I remembered. And I went on with my life, making dinner, paying bills, keeping the peace because I understood something they did not. When people think you have no leverage, they stop guarding their words and their actions. They stop hiding their shortcuts. They stop worrying about what you might do with the truth. That afternoon, as I stood in my kitchen and poured hot water over a tea bag, my phone buzzed on the counter. I did not have to look to know who it was. Caleb always called when he felt wronged, when he needed to reassert control when his narrative was threatened. I let it ring. It buzzed again, and again, then stopped. A message followed long enough that I could see the preview stretch across the screen without opening it. I turned the phone face down and carried my tea into the living room, sitting on the couch and staring at the blank wall where we had never hung pictures because he said it felt temporary. That wall had been my favorite thing about the apartment. Temporary meant flexible. Temporary meant safe. Temporary meant I could leave without tearing anything down. I thought back to the early days of our marriage when Caleb still pretended to admire my quiet. He used to say it was refreshing that I was not needy or dramatic like other women he had dated. He told his friends I was low maintenance, a phrase he delivered like a compliment and a warning at the same time. What he meant was that I did not demand proof of my worth. Over time, that trait stopped being charming to him and started being convenient. He leaned on it, he stretched it, he weaponized it, he worked late without explanation, he spent money without discussion. He let his family treat me like an accessory to his life rather than a partner in it. And when I finally asked him calmly why everything I did seemed to register as nothing to him, he shrugged and said, "Because it does not move the needle." That was the moment something in me went still. Not broken. Still. Because I realized then that the problem was not my value. It was his measure. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, and I finished my tea without tasting it. I went into the bedroom and opened the small safe bolted to the back of the closet, hidden behind winter coats and an old suitcase. Inside were documents I had never brought into our marriage, never discussed, never hinted at. Not because I was hiding out of fear, but because I had been taught carefully and deliberately that some things are safest when they are boring. I did not take anything out. I closed the safe and spun the dial because today was not about proving anything to myself. Today was about letting the system do what it had been designed to do when the truth finally entered the room. Back at the courthouse, Caleb would be pacing his confidence leaking out of him with every unanswered call, every whispered conversation that stopped when he approached. Karen would be demanding explanations, insisting there had been a mistake because women like her do not believe consequences apply to their families. Luke would be calculating, wondering if there was a way to attach himself to whatever he thought I was hiding. They would all be trying to make sense of a story that no longer centered them as the heroes. And I would be here in my small, quiet apartment, listening to the radiator hiss and the clock tick, knowing that the life they had dismissed as useless was the very thing that had allowed me to see them clearly. By the time my phone buzzed again this time with a number I recognized and had been expecting, I was calm enough to answer. Jessica Margaret Hale's voice said steady and warm. The court received the filing. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the couch. "Good," I replied. "Then we can proceed." The marriage did not collapse all at once. It eroded the way stone does under running water, quietly, patiently, until one day you realize the shape is no longer what it used to be. When Caleb and I first met, he told people he admired my calm. He said I was grounding steady, not like the women who needed constant reassurance or attention. At 24, newly graduated from law school and hungry for validation, he liked that I did not compete with his ambition. At 21, I mistook his approval for respect. We married quickly in a small ceremony his mother called sensible because it did not distract from his career trajectory. I wore a simple dress. Karen Williams smiled for photos and whispered that she was glad he had chosen someone practical. That word would come to mean something very different later. At first, the compromises felt mutual. I adjusted my schedule so I could make dinners when he worked late. I learned which days not to ask questions. He promised that once things settled, once he made partner, things would be different. That future became a convenient horizon he kept pushing further away. The first time he laughed at my job in front of someone else, it was at a firm dinner. A senior associate asked what I did, and before I could answer, Caleb said, "She keeps things organized. Nothing too demanding." People nodded politely. Someone joked about how lucky he was to have a wife who did not need to compete. I smiled because correcting him in public would have made me the problem. That became the pattern. Every time I chose restraint, it was filed away as evidence that I had nothing worth defending. As his confidence grew, so did his impatience with anything that did not feed it. He began to critique the apartment, the neighborhood, the way I dressed. He said my clothes made him look less successful. He suggested I try harder, be more polished, more impressive. When I asked what that meant, he shrugged and said I should know. Karen reinforced it with her own brand of concern, calling to suggest I take classes, learn a skill, do something productive with my time. Luke joined in laughing that Caleb was carrying the household while I coasted. None of them noticed that I paid the utilities, that I managed the groceries, that I tracked every bill so Caleb could focus on his work without distraction. Those contributions were invisible by design. They did not come with titles or applause. They simply made life function. And because life functioned, Caleb assumed it always would, regardless of how he treated the person making it possible. The contempt sharpened after his promotion. He came home later, more distracted, his phone always face down. He began to correct me constantly on small things that did not matter. The way I folded laundry, the way I spoke to servers, the way I asked questions about his day. He said I was slowing him down. He said I did not understand pressure. He said real work was not something you could clock out of. When I pointed out that my job kept the office running, that people depended on me, he laughed and said dependence was not the same as importance. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep and stayed there. His family treated it like permission. Karen started calling less, but when she did, it was to ask pointed questions about finances, about my plans, about why I had not found something better by now. Luke stopped pretending to be joking. He outright told me I was dead weight, that Caleb deserved someone who elevated him. These conversations happened openly often with Caleb present, and he never stopped them. Silence became his endorsement. I noticed then how carefully he curated his world. Anyone who reinforced his sense of superiority was welcomed. Anyone who complicated it was sidelined. I was no longer a partner. I was an accessory that had stopped matching the rest of the outfit. The affair did not surprise me when it finally surfaced. I had felt the distance long before I saw the proof. Late nights that did not line up with his schedule. Expenses he brushed off as business-related. A shift in his attention that felt practiced. When I asked him directly, calmly, he did not deny it. He looked relieved, almost grateful, and said it had just happened. He said Madison understood him. He said she was ambitious. He said she made him feel like he was moving forward instead of standing still. When I asked where that left us, he sighed and said he had been carrying me for too long. That was when Karen called not to ask how I was, but to say she hoped I would be reasonable and not make things difficult. Luke sent a message warning me not to try anything stupid. The family had already decided on the narrative. I was the obstacle. I was the reason Caleb could not fully step into his potential. Their unity in that moment was almost impressive. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I did not fight them. I did not beg. I did not argue. I listened. I watched how quickly affection turned into strategy when they thought they were dealing with someone powerless. That was when I started writing things down, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Dates, words, transfers, patterns. I did not know exactly when I would need it, only that people who feel entitled tend to leave a trail. By the time Caleb filed for divorce, he had convinced himself that I would go quietly, that I would sign whatever he put in front of me and disappear from his life without causing ripples. He believed that because I had allowed him to believe it. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing him call me useless, I realized how complete his misunderstanding was. He thought the marriage had failed because I did not rise. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. I'd stepped aside long enough for him to fall on his own. Karen Williams did not raise her voice. She never had to. Her control lived in tone and timing, in the way she could make a suggestion sound like concern and a demand sound like common sense. She was 62 when I married into the family, well-groomed, sharp-eyed, and deeply invested in the idea that her son was exceptional and everyone else existed to support that fact. From the beginning, she treated me less like a person and more like a provisional role, something that could be reassigned if it stopped serving its purpose. At first, it was subtle, little comments disguised as advice, questions that were really evaluations. She would look around our apartment and ask if we were managing on Caleb's income, her gaze lingering on the furniture, like it offended her. She would ask what my long-term plan was, not with curiosity, but with suspicion, as if my existence required justification. I answered politely. I kept my responses vague. I smiled. That encouraged her. People like Karen mistake politeness for permission. Over time, her involvement escalated. She called Caleb daily, sometimes multiple times a day, to discuss his schedule, his stress, his future. She spoke to him about me as if I were not there, even when I was sitting at the same table. She suggested he deserved more support, more admiration, more drive at home. She framed it as concern for his well-being, but the implication was always the same. I was insufficient. Luke Williams followed her lead. At 36, he lived in a perpetual state of grievance, convinced the world owed him something it had failed to deliver. He drifted between jobs, borrowed money he never repaid, and blamed his circumstances on everyone but himself. He resented my presence because it disrupted the hierarchy he believed entitled him to priority. To him, I was an outsider siphoning resources that should have belonged to him. He made that clear early on, joking loudly about how long Caleb would tolerate a wife who did not contribute, asking if I planned to make myself useful by giving the family grandchildren. Caleb laughed along. He never corrected them. His silence was not neutrality. It was alignment. Holidays became exercises in endurance. Conversations circled back to careers, money, and status, with me positioned as the obvious weak link. Karen would recount stories of women she admired, wives who had supported their husbands by stepping up, stepping back, or stepping aside as needed. The message was unmistakable. My worth was conditional. When I tried to draw boundaries to suggest that some comments were inappropriate, Karen tilted her head and asked why I was being so sensitive. Luke rolled his eyes. Caleb sighed and told me not to take everything personally. They reframed my discomfort as a flaw, my objections as instability. That tactic worked because it was consistent. Over time, it made me question whether asserting myself was worth the inevitable backlash. That was the point. The family operated as a system, each member reinforcing the others, each one benefiting from the arrangement. Karen maintained control. Luke maintained access. Caleb maintained his ego. And I maintained the household, quietly absorbing the impact so their structure could stand. When Caleb's career began to accelerate, the pressure intensified. Karen pushed harder. She began suggesting that Caleb needed someone more aligned with his trajectory. She spoke about image, about perception, about the importance of having a partner who reflected ambition. She asked him whether I challenged him enough, whether I inspired him, whether I made him proud. These were not idle questions. They were seeds planted deliberately, watered with doubt. Luke echoed her sentiments openly this time. He told Caleb he was settling, that he could do better, that people at the firm must wonder why he was with someone so ordinary. I heard these things. I was meant to hear them. They wanted me to shrink or leave on my own to save them the trouble of justifying their cruelty. Caleb did neither defend me nor stop them. He absorbed their words and let them reshape his view of our marriage. By the time the affair began, the family had already rewritten the story in their favor. Karen knew about Madison before I did. She approved. She said nothing to me, but her demeanor changed. She became warmer to Caleb, more distant with me. Luke stopped pretending to joke and started treating me like a temporary inconvenience. When I confronted Caleb calmly about the distance, he accused me of creating tension. He said his family felt uncomfortable around me because I was negative. He said I should try harder to fit in. That was when I understood the full scope of the system I was in. This was not a family that made mistakes and apologized. This was a family that identified a scapegoat and closed ranks. They had decided I was expendable. Once that decision was made, everything that followed was rationalized. The affair was justified because I was lacking. The insults were acceptable because I was weak. The dismissal was necessary because I was in the way. When Caleb filed for divorce, Karen took charge immediately. She called lawyers. She coordinated narratives. She told extended family members that the marriage had failed because I could not keep up. Luke warned me not to drag things out, framing it as advice while making it clear there would be consequences if I resisted. They assumed I would comply because compliance had always been my survival strategy. What they never considered was that I had not been complying out of fear. I had been observing. Living within a toxic system teaches you how it functions. You learn where the pressure points are. You learn who benefits from which lies. You learn how quickly loyalty evaporates when the power dynamic shifts. Sitting in that courtroom later, watching Karen's composure crack as the judge read from the sealed documents, I recognized the look in her eyes. It was not concern for her son. It was terror at losing control of the narrative. The system was collapsing, and there was no one left to blame but themselves. By the time the divorce papers were officially filed, the house we shared no longer felt like a home, but like a waiting room, the kind where time stretches unnaturally and every sound feels amplified. I moved through the days with deliberate calm, packing my belongings slowly, methodically, refusing to be rushed into panic. Caleb mistook that calm for defeat. He told people I was finally accepting reality. Karen told relatives that I was being cooperative as if my compliance validated their version of events. Luke joked openly about how quickly Caleb would bounce back once the dead weight was gone. None of them noticed what I was actually doing. I was documenting every email Karen sent on Caleb's behalf, every text Luke forwarded that crossed from advice into intimidation, every financial movement Caleb assumed I would never question. I had learned long ago that people who underestimate you are generous with evidence. Caleb grew increasingly careless as the filing date approached. He talked freely around me, assuming I was already gone mentally. He took calls in the kitchen, speaking loudly about strategy meetings and future plans that did not include me. He laughed with Madison on speakerphone, mocking my thrift, my quiet habits, the way I counted grocery expenses. Each word confirmed what I already knew. This divorce was not about incompatibility. It was about erasure. Karen visited the apartment unannounced one afternoon while Caleb was at work. She sat at the table where I was sorting paperwork and folded her hands as if she were offering condolences. She told me she hoped I understood that sometimes marriages fail because people grow in different directions. She said Caleb needed someone who matched his ambition, someone who could stand beside him without holding him back. When I did not respond, she leaned closer and said softly that dragging things out would only hurt everyone involved. There was a threat beneath her politeness. I met her gaze and thanked her for her concern. That unsettled her. She was used to emotional reactions, not neutrality. When she left, she told Caleb later that I seemed off, that I was probably trying to play games. He laughed it off. He believed he had already won. Luke escalated next. He sent me a message warning that the family had resources and connections, that it would be smarter for me to sign quickly and disappear quietly. He framed it as brotherly advice, but the intent was clear. Do not resist. Do not make noise. Do not embarrass us. I did not reply. Silence is deeply uncomfortable for people who rely on intimidation. It gives them nothing to argue against. As the court date approached, Caleb became almost cheerful. He talked about starting fresh, about how clean breaks were healthier, about how proud he was of himself for handling things decisively. He practiced his talking points the way he practiced legal arguments, confident that preparation guaranteed success. He never asked how I was holding up. He never wondered whether I had a plan. To him, I was a formality. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, choosing clothing that would not draw attention. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic. I wanted to look exactly like the woman they believed me to be. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Karen stood with Luke and Caleb already speaking to extended family members on her phone, narrating the situation before it had even begun. She stopped when she saw me and gave a tight smile. Luke smirked. Caleb avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his attorney, who was reassuring him that everything would be straightforward. They spoke openly in front of me, discussing lunch plans, timelines, next steps. They assumed I was irrelevant. When we entered the courtroom, that assumption followed them. Caleb sat confidently, leaning back in his chair, projecting ease. Karen positioned herself behind him, a silent presence meant to signal support and authority. Luke sat beside her, arms crossed, already bored. I sat alone at my table, hands folded, breathing evenly. When the clerk called the case, Caleb responded quickly, voice strong, rehearsed. His attorney summarized their position efficiently. No children, minimal assets, mutual agreement, a clean dissolution. Karen nodded along, satisfied. The judge listened without expression, flipping through the file. Then she paused. The room shifted. The judge adjusted her glasses and asked a clarifying question about supplemental filings. Caleb's attorney hesitated, glancing at his notes. He said there should be none. That was when the clerk approached with the sealed packet. The sound of it being placed on the bench was subtle but unmistakable. Karen leaned forward, frowning. Luke straightened. Caleb looked confused for the first time. As the judge began to read, the confidence drained from the room. The language was precise, formal, devastating. Karen's posture stiffened. Luke whispered something under his breath. Caleb's attorney stood attempting to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. She continued reading, her tone sharpening with each sentence. By the time she looked up, the narrative Karen had built was unraveling. The documents contradicted everything they had claimed. Financial assumptions, power dynamics, control, all exposed in black and white. I did not react. I did not need to. The truth does not require performance. As Karen's face went pale and Luke's smirk vanished, I understood something with absolute clarity. The most dangerous moment for people who abuse power is not when they are confronted with anger, but when they are confronted with consequences they cannot manipulate. The judge did not rush. She read slowly, deliberately, as if each line deserved its own space to land. That restraint was more unsettling than any raised voice could have been. Caleb's attorney tried again to object, citing procedure, timing, fairness, but the judge silenced him with a single look. She explained that the court had an obligation to consider all properly submitted filings, especially those with verified certifications and independent audits attached. Karen leaned toward Luke, whispering urgently, now her composure cracking at the edges. Luke shook his head, suddenly unsure, his earlier bravado gone. Caleb sat frozen, his confidence evaporating as he realized this was not part of the script he had prepared for. The judge summarized the contents in plain language, stripping away the legal insulation they had relied on. Separate property, premarital assets, independent trusts, documented timelines, verified signatures. None of it was speculative. None of it was emotional. It was structural. Caleb's attorney finally understood the scale of what was happening and fell silent, his posture shifting from aggressive to defensive. Karen tried to stand as if proximity might restore control, but the bailiff's presence reminded her she was not the one directing this room. Luke stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, avoiding my direction entirely. The judge turned to Caleb and asked if he understood what was being presented. His answer came out thin, uncertain. He said he needed time. The judge replied calmly that time was not a resource he could retroactively request. She reminded him that he had pressed for an expedited process, that he had represented to the court that there were no complications. Those representations were now demonstrably false. The words landed like a verdict long before anything was formally decided. Karen finally spoke, her voice tight, attempting to reframe, to suggest misunderstanding, to imply that I had misled the family. The judge cut her off immediately, reminding her that she was not a party to the case. That sentence alone dismantled years of Karen's authority. She sat back stunned, realizing her influence stopped at the courtroom door. The judge continued addressing the implications clearly. The assumptions that had underpinned the family's narrative were invalid. The power they believed they held did not exist in the way they imagined. Caleb's attempt to position himself as the dominant party was unsupported by evidence. Luke shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that proximity to this collapse carried its own risk. The judge asked if there were any further statements before she ruled on the preliminary matters. The room was silent. No one looked at me. No one asked what I wanted. That was fine. When the judge finally spoke again, her words were measured but final. She outlined the court's position regarding asset separation, legal responsibility, and future proceedings. She made it clear that any attempt to intimidate, pressure, or interfere outside the courtroom would be viewed as a serious violation. Karen's breath caught audibly at that. Luke looked down at his hands. Caleb's face flushed, then drained of color entirely. The ruling itself was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was precise. It stripped away assumptions and replaced them with reality. When the judge concluded, she banged the gavel once, clean and sharp. The sound echoed longer than expected. As people began to stand, the room buzzed with quiet shock. Karen gathered her things with trembling hands, no longer in command of the narrative she had rehearsed. Luke avoided eye contact, retreating into silence. Caleb remained seated, staring at the table as if it might offer answers. His attorney leaned in to speak to him in a low voice, urgency replacing confidence. I stood calmly, collected my folder, and prepared to leave. As I passed them, Karen finally looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, searching, calculating. She opened her mouth, perhaps to accuse, perhaps to plead. I did not wait to hear which. I walked past her without a word. That was the moment it fully settled in for her. Control is not taken. It is lost. And once lost, it does not return just because you ask for it back. After we left the courtroom, the hallway felt narrower than it had an hour earlier, as if the building itself had absorbed the shock and tightened around the people trying to escape it. Caleb's attorney moved fast, one hand on Caleb's elbow, steering him toward a corner near the vending machines as though they could hide from the reality that had just become public record. Karen followed, heels clicking too quickly, her face locked in that brittle expression she used when a plan failed, but she refused to admit it. Luke was right behind her, 33, built like he still remembered high school football, wearing a watch that looked expensive but screamed payment plan, his jaw set like intimidation was a language he spoke fluently. Caleb did not look like a man who had won anything. He looked like a man who had practiced his victory speech all night and then learned the microphone was fake. Karen, however, was not frozen. Karen was angry in the way some people get angry when the universe refuses to cooperate with their entitlement. "What did you do?" she hissed, careful to keep her voice low while her eyes burned. "What is this circus you staged in front of a judge?" I did not step back. I did not step forward. I simply held my folder against my side and met her gaze. The hallway smelled like old paper cleaning solution and stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights made everyone's skin look sallow. I could see the pores at Karen's temples, the fine line of sweat at her hairline, the tremor she tried to hide by clenching her jaw. She had spent years training herself to look unbothered. This was the first time I had seen the training fail. "I did not stage anything," I said. "I submitted what I was required to submit." Caleb's attorney lifted a hand like he wanted to intervene, but Karen ignored him. She looked at Caleb, then back to me, then to my hands, as if she expected to see a remote control. Luke moved closer to her shoulder, his presence both protective and calculating. He was the kind of man who liked power, but only when it was safe power that came from intimidation, not from risk. "You lied to my son," Karen said. "You hid who you were. You married him under false pretenses." Caleb flinched at the word son, like it reminded him that she was speaking for him, but he did not correct her. That was always his weakness. He let other people speak his truths because it kept his hands clean, and then he pretended he did not understand why the room smelled like smoke. "I used the name that is on my driver's license," I replied. "I worked the job I was hired to do. I paid rent. I paid bills. I lived the life your son asked for when he told me he wanted a wife who was simple and supportive and quiet." Karen's eyes narrowed. Do not twist this. I almost laughed at the irony, but I did not. I had learned long ago that nothing unsettles a person like Karen more than calm. Calm tells them they are not the center of the story. Your son insisted on the prenup, I continued. He insisted on the fast track. He insisted on a quick decree. He insisted on being the one protected by paperwork. Today, the paperwork did what paperwork does. It told the truth. Luke's hand flexed at his side. He leaned in, voice lower than Karen's, sharp with threat. You need to stop. This is going to destroy Caleb. Do you understand that? He is a lawyer. This will end his career. I looked at Luke, then back at Karen, then at Caleb, whose face was still pale under the courthouse lights. You mean the career he used to open credit in my name, I said. The career he used to bill vacations as client development. The career he used to treat staff like furniture. That career. Caleb's attorney sucked in a breath. Karen's face went white in a way that made her blush look painted on. Caleb finally lifted his head. What is she talking about? He asked, voice hoarse. His attorney's eyes flicked to me. He had not expected that line. He had expected a rich wife surprise maybe, but not the kind of surprise that triggered subpoenas and bar complaints. He suddenly looked like a man who had just realized his client had sold him a story. Karen snapped. Caleb, do not listen to her. She is trying to ruin you because you left her. I turned slightly so Karen could see the edge of the folder in my hand. This is not about being left, I said. This is about being used. Luke raised his chin, attempting to regain dominance. You think money makes you untouchable. It does not. People talk. The press will eat this up. You will be a headline and not a flattering one. That would matter, I said, if I cared about headlines. Karen scoffed, but it sounded forced. Then what do you want? That question was the most honest thing she had asked all morning, and it revealed everything about her worldview. Everyone wanted something. Everyone could be bought. Everyone had a price, and Karen had spent decades believing she was the person who got to name that price. I answered her without raising my voice. I want my name cleared. I want the fraud stopped. I want the accounts frozen so no one can move money and pretend it never happened. I want a forensic review so no one can blame me later for debt I did not create. I want your son to face consequences for what he chose to do. Karen's lips parted. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle in a language she did not speak. You want him punished? She whispered, and the word punished carried a childlike disbelief, as if consequences were a concept meant for other families. I want him accountable, I corrected. Caleb's attorney finally found his voice stepping between us with professional urgency. Mrs. Vance, I need you to step back, he said to Karen. Then he turned to Caleb. We need to talk privately right now. Yeah? Karen tried to follow, but the attorney lifted a palm. Not you, he said, and the insult landed cleanly. Karen blinked, stunned, as if she had never been told no in a hallway before. Luke grabbed her arm gently, not out of tenderness, but out of necessity, guiding her a few steps away. He leaned close to her ear, whispering something that made her nostrils flare. Luke was the fixer, the man who had handled messy family conversations by threatening people until they apologized. He did not know what to do when the other side brought documents instead of tears. Caleb's attorney pulled Caleb toward an alcove and spoke in a tight, controlled tone. I could not hear everything, but I caught fragments. If she files, criminal exposure, bar discipline, identity theft, and the sentence that made Caleb's knees bend slightly. If the judge refers this, you are not dealing with divorce court anymore. Caleb's face crumpled. She would not, he mouthed. Then he looked at me as if I had become a stranger wearing his wife's face. He took a step toward me, voice cracking. Jessica, please. We can talk. We can fix this. Fix. That word had been his favorite for years, usually directed at me as a command. Fix the schedule. Fix the grocery budget. Fix the mood in the room. Fix his mother's opinion. Fix his brother's resentment. Fix the parts of his life he did not want to own. Now he was trying to use it like a rope. I did not move. There is nothing to fix, I said. You already chose. You chose to mock me while signing papers. You chose to bring your mother and brother to a courtroom like they were witnesses to your triumph. You chose to treat the contract you demanded like it was a toy. You chose to take what was not yours. Karen heard him pleading and snapped back into motion. She marched over, eyes blazing with a rage that sounded like panic. "Do not beg her," she spat at Caleb. "She is enjoying this." I looked at Karen again. "You trained him to believe begging is weakness," I said. "But what you actually trained him to believe is that cruelty is strength." Karen's mouth tightened. "You were never good enough for him," she said, and the sentence came out automatically like a reflex she had practiced in front of a mirror. "He needed a woman who could elevate him." Luke nodded, trying to add weight. "Caleb deserves better than this." I held Karen's gaze. "Your son deserved decency from himself," I said. "He failed." Caleb made a desperate sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped with shaking fingers. He looked like he was about to call someone important, someone who could reverse gravity. Then he stopped. He stared at the screen and his shoulders sagged. Because for the first time he realized there was no person he could call who had more authority than the documents the judge had just read. Karen's voice rose. "You cannot do this to our family. Do you hear me? You cannot." Our family. That was always her favorite shield. She had used it to excuse every cruelty, every boundary violation, every demand. Family meant immunity. Family meant the law was optional. Family meant my silence was required. In that hallway under those lights, family meant nothing. "I am not doing anything to your family," I said. "Your family did this to itself." Luke stepped closer, trying intimidation again. "You think you can walk away. You cannot. Caleb's friends are everywhere, his colleagues, people in the city. You will be watched." I looked at Luke with steady patience. "Threatening me in a courthouse hallway is not a smart move," I said. "There are cameras." Luke froze. Karen's eyes flicked upward, suddenly aware of the corners of the ceiling. Caleb's attorney shifted his wait eyes, darting too, as if calculating how many angles had captured this conversation. I continued, voice still quiet. "If you contact me outside counsel, if you harass me, if you show up at my apartment, if you try to spin a narrative that I am unstable or deceitful, my team will respond. Not with gossip. With filings." Karen's lips trembled. "Team," she repeated as though the word itself was offensive. I did not explain what she already understood, that the world she believed belonged to her was bigger than her living room, that there were people who did not care about her tone, her tears, or her threats, that contracts and audits and court orders were realer than her opinion. Caleb stepped forward again, softer now, pleading without swagger. "I did not know," he said. "I did not know about any of this. I thought you were just Jessica. You let me believe it." I met his eyes. "I was Jessica," I said. "I am Jessica. I did not pretend to be kind. I was kind. You just assumed kindness was stupidity." That landed harder than any insult. Caleb's face twisted, and I saw the shame underneath the fear. He wanted to rewrite history into something he could defend. He wanted to call it a trick. He wanted to call it a trap. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He had revealed himself one small cruelty at a time until his mask was gone. Karen abruptly turned her anger into strategy the way she always did when a fight started to slip from her control. "We can settle," she said quickly. "Name it. We will make this go away." There it was. The offer. The belief that the universe ran on bargaining. She did not even realize how insulting it sounded, as if I were a problem that could be paid off like a late fee. "I am not taking hush money from you," I replied. Karen's eyes flashed. "Then you are vindictive." "No," I said. "I am finished." My phone vibrated once in my coat pocket. A single controlled buzz, not the frantic kind. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen, then slid it back. The timing was almost too neat, almost theatrical. But it was not theater. It was planning. Caleb's attorney noticed the movement and swallowed. "Who is that?" he asked, and he tried to sound casual, but he failed. "My counsel," I said, and I watched the word land. Karen scoffed. "Counsel. Oh, please, she wants to sound important." Caleb's attorney did not scoff. He looked at Caleb and saw a client who had not told him the truth. He looked at Karen and saw an unhelpful witness. He looked at me and saw a person with leverage that was not emotional, not performative, but procedural. I took one step back, creating space. "This conversation is over," I said, and I kept my voice steady because steadiness is its own kind of boundary. Karen reached for me as if she could grab the situation by the wrist. "You do not get to walk away," she snapped. I held up my hand, not touching her, just showing the simplest line in the sand. "Watch me," I said. Then I turned and walked down the corridor toward the exit, the sound of my shoes measured and even. Behind me, I heard Karen's voice crack into fury, heard Luke try to quiet her, heard Caleb call my name once, twice, like he believed repetition could undo a court filing. I did not turn around. Outside, the air was cold and bright, and the city noise rolled over me like water. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed, not as a performance, not as a victory, but as a reset. Because for the first time in a long time, my silence belonged to me. I did not go straight home after leaving the courthouse. I knew better than to walk back into familiar space while adrenaline was still running through my system, while my phone was still capable of lighting up with messages that pretended to be concern but carried sharp edges underneath. Instead, I walked. I let the city absorb the excess noise in my head. The sidewalks were busy with people who had no idea what had just shifted inside that building behind me. Office workers rushed past with coffee cups. A woman argued into her phone. A man laughed too loudly at something his friend said. Life continued indifferent and grounding. That indifference mattered. It reminded me that what had happened was significant to me, to them, to the family that had tried to erase me, but it was not the center of the universe. Power thrives when it convinces you that it is all there is. I stopped at a quiet cafe 2 blocks away, the kind with scratched wooden tables and a chalkboard menu written in careful handwriting. I chose a seat near the window where I could see the street without being seen too clearly myself. When the barista asked what I wanted, my voice came out steady. I ordered tea, nothing complicated. Small choices matter after large confrontations. They remind you that you still own yourself. I set my folder on the table and did not open it. I did not need to review what was inside. I already knew it by heart. What I needed now was distance, not from the facts, but from the people who would try to rewrite them. My phone buzzed again. This time, I let it ring out. Then again. Then again. I did not check who it was. I knew without looking. Caleb would be cycling through emotions denial, giving way to fear. Fear giving way to bargaining. Karen would be calling anyone she believed might still listen. Luke would be strategizing, trying to find an angle that did not exist. Silence was not avoidance. It was containment. After a few minutes, the buzzing stopped. That silence was earned. I took a sip of tea and watched condensation slide down the glass. My mind replayed the courtroom, not the dramatic moments, but the small ones. Karen being told she was not a party. Luke looking down when intimidation failed. Caleb realizing too late that preparation without honesty is just arrogance with notes. Those details mattered more than the headlines that would never be written. They were the proof that systems crack when exposed to daylight. Eventually, I paid and left. Outside, I checked my phone for the first time. There were 12 missed calls and 17 messages. I did not read them. I forwarded the log to my attorney and sent a single text to a number saved under a neutral name. "I am ready to proceed." The reply came less than a minute later. "Understood, we are moving." That was it. That. No encouragement, no reassurance, just action. That was how I preferred it. When I finally returned to the apartment I had shared with Caleb, the air felt different, quieter. Not because it was empty, but because the tension that had lived there for years had lost its anchor. I packed the last of my things methodically, placing each item into a box without nostalgia. Objects are only heavy when you assign them meaning they no longer deserve. I left the key on the counter and walked out without looking back. I knew Karen would frame that as abandonment. Luke would call it proof that I was unstable. Caleb would tell himself it meant I still cared enough to be hurt. None of those interpretations mattered. Meaning is not owned by the loudest voice. That night, I stayed in a hotel near the river high enough up that the city lights looked distant and calm. I ordered room service and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. I slept deeply for the first time in months. The next morning, reality arrived with precision. My attorney called to confirm filings, timelines, boundaries. He spoke in terms of process, not emotion. He explained what would happen next and what would not. He told me which communications to ignore and which to document. He reminded me that escalation often follows exposure, that people who lose control tend to thrash before they retreat. I thanked him and hung up. Less than an hour later, the first article appeared. It was not dramatic. It did not name me. It mentioned a local attorney facing questions over financial conduct connected to a divorce proceeding. It used words like alleged and under review. It was careful. That care was telling. By noon, Caleb's firm had issued a statement placing him on administrative leave pending investigation. Karen called me from an unfamiliar number. I did not answer. Luke sent a message warning me that things were getting serious, as if seriousness had not been the point all along. Caleb sent a long email subject line, simply, "Jessica." I did not open it. I forwarded it to counsel. That afternoon, I received confirmation that accounts had been frozen, motions acknowledged, timelines set. Each update was a quiet door closing behind me. I felt no triumph. I felt clarity. The world had stopped bending to accommodate lies. That was enough. In the days that followed, the family attempted to regain control in the only ways they knew. Karen reached out to mutual acquaintances, casting herself as a mother protecting her son from a manipulative spouse. Luke hinted at retaliation, then backtracked when reminded of recorded conversations and public filings. Caleb oscillated between apology and accusation, his messages growing shorter, then longer, then incoherent. I did not engage. Engagement feeds chaos. Boundaries starve it. One evening, a message came through that I did read. It was from Karen. It was not angry. It was not threatening. It was something else. It said she never expected things to go this far, that families make mistakes, that perhaps we could talk privately, woman to woman. That message told me everything I needed to know. She still believed control could be reclaimed through proximity. I deleted it without responding. The next morning, a court order arrived confirming protections I had requested. It was formal, unemotional, and absolute. Seeing my name typed there not as an accessory or an afterthought, but as a principle, grounded me in a way nothing else had. This was not revenge. This was structure. Weeks later, when the noise had dulled and the panic had shifted into resignation, I received one final message from Caleb. It was brief. He said he never thought I would be the one who broke the system. I did not reply. Breaking the system was never my goal. Stepping out of it was. Time does something interesting after a public collapse. It stretches for the people who are trying to contain damage, and it contracts for the people who are finally free to move forward. In the weeks after the filings became impossible to ignore, my life narrowed in the best possible way. Fewer conversations, fewer explanations, fewer performances. I woke up, worked, documented when necessary, and let the rest of the noise pass around me like weather. The investigation into Caleb's conduct progressed with mechanical precision. Requests for records, interviews scheduled and rescheduled. Quiet confirmations that certain behaviors were not just unethical, but actionable. None of that required my commentary. I had already given what was needed. Meanwhile, the Williams family unraveled in stages, each one convinced they could manage the fallout if they just spoke to the right person or applied the right pressure. Karen tried to reclaim moral authority first. She sent carefully worded emails to extended family, framing the situation as a tragic misunderstanding driven by my supposed instability. She emphasized how devastated Caleb was, how blindsided the family felt, how unfair it was that private matters had become public. What she did not include were facts. No dates, no documents, no explanations for discrepancies. People listened politely and then stopped responding. Moral authority without evidence does not travel far. Luke attempted a different strategy. He reached out to mutual acquaintances in the city, hinting that I was dangerous, that I had deceived everyone, that there was more to the story. Someone forwarded me one of his messages, not to warn me, but to ask if it was true. I replied with a single sentence and attached a publicly available filing. The conversation ended there. Luke did not try again. Caleb spiraled more visibly. Being placed on leave stripped him of the identity he had relied on to justify everything else. Without his title, without the daily reinforcement of being important, he had nothing to buffer the shame. He reached out repeatedly, cycling through apologies and accusations, responsibility and deflection. He said he loved me. He said I had set him up. He said his mother was losing sleep. He said he could not believe I would do this to him. Each message revealed the same core misunderstanding. He still believed the center of the story was his pain. It was not. I did not respond. My attorney handled necessary communication with efficiency and distance. That distance was intentional. Direct engagement would have given Caleb something to push against. Silence gave him nothing. As weeks turned into months, the narrative Karen had tried to control slipped further from her grasp. The investigation did not care about tone or intention. It cared about patterns. It cared about numbers. It cared about whether actions aligned with representations. Those questions have a way of cutting through family loyalty. When Caleb was formally charged with professional misconduct, Karen stopped calling. Luke went quiet. The system they had trusted to protect them had turned neutral, and neutrality felt like betrayal to people accustomed to special treatment. I moved into a new apartment during that time, smaller than the one I had shared with Caleb, but chosen entirely by me. I painted the walls a soft, neutral color and filled the space with light. I unpacked slowly, intentionally, deciding what deserved a place in my life and what did not. That process mirrored everything else. Choice by choice, boundary by boundary. One afternoon as I was shelving books, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized but had not seen in months. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Karen. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual confidence. She did not accuse or threaten. She asked how I was doing. The question felt foreign, almost inappropriate. I told her I was well. There was a pause long enough that I considered hanging up. Then she said she never imagined things would end like this. I listened without interrupting. She spoke about stress, about embarrassment, about how the family was being judged. She spoke about how hard this had been for her. When she finally stopped, she waited as if expecting reassurance. I gave her none. Instead, I said something simple and true. I said this ended the way it did because no one intervened when it mattered, because cruelty was rewarded and decency was dismissed, because silence was mistaken for weakness. Karen inhaled sharply. She said I did not understand what it was like to protect your child. I told her I understood more than she thought. Protecting a child does not mean shielding them from consequences. It means teaching them how to face them. She did not respond. The call ended shortly after. That was the last conversation we ever had. The divorce itself concluded without drama. The terms reflected what had been evident from the beginning. No grand gestures, no symbolic victories, just finality. Caleb did not attend the final hearing. His attorney appeared on his behalf subdued and efficient. I signed where required and left. Outside, the sky was overcast, heavy with rain that had not yet fallen. I stood for a moment and let the weight of it register. Then I walked away. Months later, when everything had settled into record and memory, I ran into Luke unexpectedly at a grocery store. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. He nodded stiffly and did not approach. I returned the nod and continued down the aisle. There was nothing left to say. People often ask if I regret how things unfolded. They frame it as a question about mercy, about forgiveness, about whether I could have handled it more quietly. I tell them the truth. I handled it exactly as quietly as I was allowed to. I did not raise my voice. I did not seek attention. I did not weaponize emotion. I respected the system that exists to hold people accountable when private power is abused. If that system made noise, it was not because I shouted. It was because the truth resonates. I did not win anything in the traditional sense. I did not gain status or admiration or revenge. What I gained was ownership of my own narrative and the certainty that my silence was a choice, not a constraint. That certainty is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply exists steady and immovable. And that is more than enough. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was intentional. Once the legal process moved from active confrontation into resolution, there were no more urgent calls, no more updates that required immediate reaction. That absence revealed something I had not expected. Space. Space to think without bracing. Space to exist without anticipating someone else's demand. For the first time in years, my days were not shaped by avoidance or endurance. They were shaped by choice. I returned to work with a clarity that startled even me. Without the constant erosion of being undermined at home, my focus sharpened. Colleagues noticed. Conversations shifted. I was no longer careful in the way people become careful when they expect dismissal. I spoke when I had something to say, and I stopped when I did not. That confidence was quiet, unperformative, and it changed how people responded to me. It also changed how I saw myself. I had spent years believing strength had to be concealed to survive. I learned it could also be expressed through restraint. News about Caleb continued to circulate, though less frequently. Investigations tend to lose public interest once outrage is replaced by process. That suited me. I did not need an audience for what came next. His firm ultimately terminated his position. The bar initiated disciplinary proceedings that moved at their own deliberate pace. He attempted to appeal decisions, then withdrew, then attempted again. Each attempt narrowed his options further. Karen withdrew from public life almost entirely. The woman who had once orchestrated conversations now avoided them. Luke resurfaced briefly, trying to attach himself to other people's projects, other people's authority. It did not work. Reputation once cracked rarely resets cleanly. The family system that had thrived on control had lost its central pillar. Without someone to manage perception, the truth stood on its own. One afternoon, months later, I received a formal notice confirming the final disposition of the misconduct case. I read it once and filed it away. I did not reread it. Closure does not require repetition. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a small professional panel about ethics and administrative oversight. I almost declined. Visibility had never been my goal, but I accepted understanding that silence and disappearance are not the same thing. On that panel, I spoke carefully, avoiding specifics, focusing instead on systems, on how ordinary people become collateral damage when accountability is treated as optional. I watched faces in the audience change as they recognized familiar patterns. Afterward, a woman in her late 50s approached me and thanked me for putting language to something she had lived through for decades. That mattered more than any headline ever could. My personal life adjusted slowly. Trauma does not evaporate just because justice arrives. I relearned what calm felt like without tension underneath it. I relearned how to trust my own perceptions. Some evenings were quiet to the point of discomfort. Others were filled with small joys I had forgotten were possible. Cooking without criticism, reading without interruption, sleeping without waiting for a door to open. These were not dramatic victories. They were foundational. I encountered Caleb once more by accident on a crowded street. He looked older, diminished, as if the weight of unearned confidence had been removed all at once. Our eyes met briefly. He did not approach. I did not either. There was no anger left, only recognition. People like him often confuse consequence with cruelty because they have never been asked to hold themselves. That encounter did not unsettle me. It confirmed something I already knew. I had not destroyed his life. I had simply stopped protecting him from himself. When people ask me now what the hardest part was, they expect me to talk about betrayal, about humiliation, about the moment he mocked me while signing divorce papers. Those moments hurt, yes, but the hardest part was deciding to stop shrinking, to stop editing myself for the comfort of people who benefited from my silence. That decision required more courage than confrontation ever could. I do not tell my story often. When I do, I tell it plainly, not as a warning, not as a triumph, but as a record. Systems fail when they are built on entitlement. Families become dangerous when loyalty replaces accountability. Silence can be a shield or a cage. The difference lies in who controls it. I control mine now. That control does not look impressive from the outside. It looks like peace. And peace, I have learned, is the most radical outcome of all. The last phase did not arrive with a bang or a public reckoning. It arrived the way truth usually does, quietly, after everyone who wanted to argue with it ran out of energy. I noticed it first in the way my mornings settled into a rhythm that did not require recovery time. I woke without the old inventory of worries. I drank coffee without bracing for criticism. I planned my day without calculating how it would be received by someone else. That internal shift was subtle but permanent. It marked the point where my life stopped reacting and started choosing. The legal residue continued to resolve itself in the background. Notices arrived, deadlines passed, confirmations followed. Each piece clicked into place with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. I signed when required, archived when finished, and moved on. There was no urge to revisit. Closure, I learned, is not a feeling. It is a sequence completed. Around that time, my work began to take a new shape. Projects that once felt like maintenance became opportunities. I was invited into conversations earlier. My input was requested rather than tolerated. People respond differently when you stop apologizing for existing. I did not announce any change. I simply stopped editing my presence. That difference was enough. I mentored a junior colleague who reminded me of myself years earlier, careful, capable, underestimated. I told her one thing that mattered. Do not confuse being agreeable with being safe. Safety comes from boundaries, not approval. She nodded like the sentence had unlocked something she already knew but had not trusted. Word of Caleb's final disciplinary outcome arrived without fanfare. It was definitive. The language was formal, unemotional, and irreversible. I read it once, felt the weight of it settle, and then placed it in a file labeled closed. I did not celebrate. I did not mourn. Consequences are not celebrations. They are conclusions. Karen did not contact me again. Mutual acquaintances reported that she had retreated into a smaller world, one where she could control fewer variables and therefore harm fewer people. Luke drifted away from the city entirely. Someone said he moved west. Someone else said he was starting over. The truth did not matter. Distance does. The further they moved from my life, the clearer my days became. I built a small circle of people who understood quiet strength. Dinners were unremarkable in the best way. Conversations did not perform. Laughter came without edges. Trust rebuilt itself not through declarations but through consistency. I learned what it meant to be believed without having to prove anything. That lesson was worth the years it took to learn. Occasionally, someone would ask if I felt vindicated. The word never fit. Vindication suggests a contest. I did not compete. I exited. I tell them the same thing each time. I feel aligned. Alignment is not loud. It does not need witnesses. It feels like standing straight without effort. On a rainy afternoon, I visited a bookstore near the river and found a notebook with a plain cover. I bought it without a reason. At home, I wrote a single line on the first page. Silence is a tool. Use it, do not live inside it. I closed the notebook and placed it on a shelf where I could see it without needing it. That felt right. I did not erase my past. I contextualized it. The woman who endured did not disappear. She integrated. She learned when to step back and when to step forward. She learned that kindness without boundaries invites harm, and boundaries without cruelty invite respect. If there is a lesson I carry forward, it is this. People will tell you who they are when they believe you cannot challenge them. Listen, write it down, and when the time comes, choose structure over spectacle. Structure outlasts outrage. I did not become powerful by revealing who I was. I became powerful by letting others reveal who they were and then refusing to carry their consequences. That refusal was the turning point. Now, when I walk through my life, I do so without explaining my worth. I do not need to. The systems that once ignored me now recognize me. The people who once dismissed me no longer have access. My silence is no longer misread. It is understood. And if it is not, that is no longer my problem. There was one more layer I did not expect, and it had nothing to do with courts or money. It was the way my body stopped flinching. One evening, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, and I realized halfway through the sound that my shoulders had not lifted toward my ears. My stomach had not tightened. My mind had not started drafting explanations. The footsteps passed, the building settled, and I kept reading my book like a person who was actually allowed to exist in peace. That moment felt small, but it was the true verdict. Because the hardest part of leaving is not the leaving, it is the retraining. You spend so long being measured by someone else that you forget what your own normal feels like. Mine returned in pieces. I started cooking meals that did not have to be quick. I hung art on the walls because I liked it, not because it looked appropriate. I stopped buying clothes that disappeared and started buying clothes that fit my life, my body, my taste. I was not reinventing myself. I was reclaiming what I had been quietly editing out to avoid conflict. I also did one thing that felt almost too gentle to count as revenge, which is why it mattered. I wrote a letter to my younger self, the version of me who thought endurance was love. I told her she was not foolish for believing in people, but she was allowed to stop believing when the evidence became consistent. I told her that being calm was not weakness, and being practical was not a lack of romance. It was intelligence. I folded the letter and placed it in that plain notebook, not as a wound, but as a record of a promise. From that point forward, I would not negotiate with disrespect. I would not argue with contempt. I would not stay in rooms where my humanity was treated like an inconvenience. And the strangest part is that once I made that promise and kept it, the world around me reorganized. Invitations changed. Opportunities widened. The quality of people who approached me improved. Not because I became someone new, but because I stopped making myself available to the old pattern. That is the part I wish someone had told me earlier. You do not have to punish the people who tried to shrink you. You just have to stop fitting inside the space they made for you. The ending people expect is usually loud. They want a final confrontation, a speech that lands like a verdict, a moment where everyone involved understands exactly how wrong they were and how right I was. That ending makes sense in movies. It feels satisfying. It also rarely happens in real life. Real endings are quieter, more durable, and far less interested in applause. Mine arrived gradually, then all at once, in the form of a life that no longer required explanation. The divorce decree arrived by mail on an ordinary weekday, folded neatly, unremarkable in appearance, final in effect. I opened it at my kitchen table, read it carefully, and signed where required. No trembling hands, no rush of emotion, just a steady recognition that this chapter was complete. I placed the papers into a folder labeled Finished and slid it into a drawer I rarely opened. That drawer became a boundary, not just legally, but mentally. What is finished does not get revisited for entertainment. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects became clearer. Caleb's name faded from professional conversations. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly. Invitations stopped coming. His voice carried less weight. The world did not punish him. It simply stopped accommodating him. That distinction matters. Karen's social circle contracted to people who already agreed with her. Luke disappeared entirely, leaving behind only rumors that no longer interested me. I did not track their outcomes. I did not need to. Detachment is not indifference. It is the decision to place your attention where it can grow something instead of where it can only defend itself. My own life expanded in small, intentional ways. I traveled alone for the first time, not to escape, but to arrive somewhere as myself without context. I sat in restaurants without rushing. I walked unfamiliar streets without rehearsing who I was supposed to be. No one asked me to justify my presence. That freedom was intoxicating in its simplicity. Back home, I deepened friendships that had survived my absence without resentment. We spoke honestly about the years I had been quiet and the reasons why. No one scolded me for staying too long. They understood something that had taken me years to accept. You leave when you are ready, not when others think you should be. I also learned to recognize warning signs earlier. Not red flags in the dramatic sense, but subtle patterns. Jokes that diminish. Advice that feels like control. Concern that erases agency. I did not confront every instance. I simply adjusted my distance. Healthy people adjust with you. Unhealthy people protest. That contrast became one of my most reliable tools. Occasionally, someone would still bring up the story having heard pieces of it through professional circles or mutual acquaintances. They would ask how it felt to finally reveal who I really was, as if the power came from disclosure. I corrected them gently. The power did not come from revelation. It came from documentation, patience, and restraint. It came from letting people operate under their own assumptions until those assumptions collapsed under scrutiny. That is not manipulation. It is accountability deferred until it is unavoidable. If there is a moral to all of this, it is not about wealth or secrets or dramatic reversals. It is about misjudgment. People misjudge quiet women all the time. They mistake calm for compliance, practicality for limitation, kindness for naivety. That misjudgment is not an accident. It is a habit reinforced by systems that reward loudness and entitlement. You cannot dismantle that habit by arguing with it. You dismantle it by refusing to carry its consequences. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for understanding. I did not ask to be believed. I let structure speak where emotion would have been dismissed. That choice protected me in ways anger never could have. Today, my life is not extraordinary. It is orderly, peaceful, and mine. I work, I rest, I choose carefully who has access to my time and my energy. I no longer confuse loyalty with self-erasure. I no longer stay silent to keep others comfortable. When I am quiet now, it is because I am listening, not because I am afraid. That distinction is everything. If someone hearing this recognizes themselves in the version of me who stayed too long, who smiled through dismissal, who believed endurance was the same as love, I want them to hear this clearly. You are not weak for surviving the way you did. You are allowed to stop surviving and start living. You do not need a dramatic exit. You need a plan, a record, and the willingness to let consequences do the work you were never meant to do alone. In the end, the most honest sentence I can offer is this. He called me useless because it was easier than admitting he needed me invisible. He mocked me while signing divorce papers because he believed the story he had told himself. He never knew who I really was because he never bothered to look. And when the truth finally arrived, it did not announce itself. It simply stood there undeniable and let everything else fall away.